The day my son told me I had lost my mind. There were 7 people in the room. My daughter Thuy had driven 4 hours from Da Nang. Mr. Hoang Van Duke from next door sat near the window with his tea going cold, the way it always did when he forgot to drink it. Miss Linda Tran, who had worked beside me for 11 years at the accounting office, was perched on the edge of the wooden chair nearest the altar, her back straight the way it always was when she felt uncomfortable. 2 of Minja's business associates stood near the doorway, men whose names I had never bothered to learn. Men in clean shirts, who smelled like the kind of cologne that cost more than a week of groceries. And Min himself stood at the center of the room, one hand resting on the back of my husband's favorite chair, as if he had always owned it. He said it clearly. No stumbling, no hesitation. You've lost your mind, old woman. You can't even remember what you signed. I looked at him for a long moment. Then, I smiled. Not the polite smile I gave to strangers, not the careful smile I wore at New Year's gatherings, just a small, quiet smile. The kind that means nothing on the surface and everything underneath. Nobody in that room understood why I was smiling. That was fine. They weren't supposed to. Not yet. Let me take you back to where this really began. Not the argument, not the documents, not the day I first noticed the numbers didn't add up. Further back than all of that. 32 years ago, I sat at a narrow desk in a government tax office, with a window that faced the alley behind the building. The alley smelled like charcoal and rain and motorbike exhaust. Every morning I came in early, before the other accountants arrived, and I worked through the files that others had left partially done. Not because I had been asked to, because the numbers bothered me when they were wrong. A figure out of place sat in my mind like a pebble in a shoe, small, persistent, impossible to ignore until it was corrected. My husband Duke used to say I was born with a ledger instead of a heart. He meant it kindly. He knew what I was. He died 7 years ago. Liver failure, slow and then fast. The way those things go. I washed his face the morning he passed, and I told him the numbers in our household accounts were balanced down to the last dong, that he didn't need to worry about anything. He smiled at that. That was the last time I made him smile, and I have never regretted what I said. After he was gone, I retired from the accounting firm, where I had spent the last 18 years of my working life. I was 62. I was not tired of numbers. I was tired of sitting in offices that smelled like other people's ambitions. I came home. I tended the altar. I kept my records, the way I had always kept them, every document in its proper place, every year its own folder, nothing thrown away, nothing misplaced. The blue tin box had belonged to my husband's mother. It was a simple thing, painted blue, a lock with a 4-digit combination that I had reset the first week I owned it. Inside I kept the most important papers. Not the originals, those went into the filing cabinet in the back bedroom, but the copies, my summaries. The careful tallies I worked out by hand each year in a small lined notebook, the kind school children used, because I trusted my own handwriting more than any software. Every tax filing since 1987. Every W-2, every 1099 form. Every refund figure, and every amount owed. 36 years of numbers, organized and intact, because that is what I knew how to do. That is what I had always done. Min had been handling the annual filings for 4 years. That was his suggestion, not mine. He had come to me the spring after his father died, when I was still learning how to move through the house quietly so I wouldn't feel its emptiness so sharply. He said I deserved to rest. He said Derek Stafford was excellent, very professional, that many business owners in the city used him. He said all I needed to do was sign the authorization forms and he would take care of everything else. I said yes. That surprised me later when I thought about it. I was not a woman who said yes easily to things she didn't understand. But I had just buried my husband, and the house was very quiet, and Min was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at me with an expression I mistook, at the time, for concern. The first year the refund came through, it was lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower. Just enough to make me pause, set my teacup down, and look at the deposit notification a second time. I said nothing. I filed the figure in my notebook. I noted the discrepancy in the margin in small, neat pencil. Check against original. I checked. The numbers Min brought me didn't match what I had worked out myself. I said nothing. The second year, the gap was wider. The third year, I got the blue tin box down from the shelf in the back bedroom and I sat at the kitchen table under the lamp that my husband had always complained was too bright for evening, and I worked through every figure from the beginning. 4 years of filings, 4 years of refund amounts, 4 years of W-2s and 1,099 forms against the numbers that had actually appeared on the returns Derek Stafford had filed under my name. $31,420. I wrote that number down in my notebook. I underlined it once. Then I closed the notebook and made myself a cup of tea and sat looking at the altar, at my husband's photograph, at the incense that had burned down to ash. The smoke from the incense had long since faded, but the scent of it still lived in the wood of the cabinet, the way certain things remain long after their visible presence is gone. My mother used to say, "Still water runs deepest. The river that makes no noise is the one that has carved the farthest into the rock. I am a still river." I have been cutting through rock for 32 years. And I still had every number, in my own handwriting, in a blue tin box with a lock that only I knew how to open. My husband chose this house because of the light. That was what he told me, standing in the empty front room, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1989, the year we were married. The previous owners had left nothing behind except a cracked ceramic pot near the back door and a smell of mildew in the second bedroom that took 2 months and 3 coats of paint to fully banish. Duke stood in the center of the room with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted back, watching the way the afternoon came through the high windows and fell across the bare concrete floor in long, pale rectangles. "The light is good here," he said. I looked around at the water stains on the ceiling, the warped wooden door frame, the single bare bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the room. I was 26 years old, and I had been working as a junior accountant for 3 years, and I understood the value of things in precise numerical terms. "The price is too high for the condition," I said. He smiled at me the way he always smiled, when he thought I was being practical at the wrong moment. We bought the house. I have never regretted it. Not even now, sitting in the same front room 35 years later, watching the same light fall through the same windows onto floors I had refinished twice, walls I had repainted 4 times, a room that had held 3 decades of ordinary life meals and arguments and quiet evenings, and one terrible night, when the doctor called at 2 in the morning, and I understood from his voice before he finished the sentence, everything was about to change. The altar stands in the corner of the main room, where the cracked ceramic pot used to be. I built it properly after Duke died, the way his mother had shown me when we were first married. Dark wood, 2 red candles, a photograph taken at his retirement dinner in 2014. He is laughing at something, someone said just before the shutter clicked, and his eyes are almost closed. And every time I look at it, I think about how strange it is that joy and grief can live in the same image without either one diminishing the other. I burn incense every morning, 2 sticks, never more, never less. The smoke rises and flattens against the ceiling, and the scent of it moves through the whole house by mid-morning, settling into the curtains, the cushions, the old wooden desk in the back bedroom where I kept my files. Sometimes in the early evening, when the light is low and the windows are open and there is a breeze coming in from the alley, I can close my eyes and the house smells exactly as it did when Duke was alive, and I feel, for just a moment, that the years have not moved as far as I know they have. This is the house where I raised 2 children. Tui was born in the back bedroom during a rainstorm in November of 1991, because the flooding that year had made the roads impossible, and the midwife arrived on a bicycle with her coat soaked through to the skin. She came into the world efficiently, without drama, which suited her personality exactly. She has been efficient and undramatic her entire life. She became a pharmacist. She calls me every Sunday at 9 in the morning without fail, and she says what she means and she means what she says, and I have never once had to wonder where I stood with her. Min was born 3 years before Thuy, in a hospital across the city, in a room with white walls and a ceiling fan that made a clicking sound on every rotation. He was a large baby, stubborn from the beginning. He cried for the first 6 months of his life with a determination that seemed almost professional. Duke used to walk him back and forth across this same front room at 3 in the morning, humming off key, both of them swaying in the dark. I watched them from the doorway, those nights. My husband and my firstborn son, moving together through the dark room, the streetlight coming in through the curtains and laying a thin stripe of gold across the floor. Duke's face in those moments was so open, so unguarded. He was not a man who showed softness easily. But with that child in his arms, all of it was visible, every tender thing he carried and rarely spoke about. I thought, this is what I will remember. Not the arguments, not the difficult years, not the money we didn't have when the children were small. This. I was right to think that. I only wish the memory had stayed simpler. Min grew into a complicated person. I saw it happening, and I did not know what to do about it, which is a particular kind of helplessness that I suspect most mothers understand. He was intelligent in the way that makes a person impatient. He wanted things quickly not because he was lazy, but because he could see what he wanted with great clarity, and the distance between wanting and having frustrated him in a way he never fully learned to manage. He married a woman from Saigon who wore shoes that cost more than my monthly utilities and who called me by my first name without asking whether that was acceptable. He started 3 businesses in 8 years. 2 failed. The third was surviving in the way that a plant survives without enough water, technically alive, visibly struggling. I knew all of this. I watched all of this. I said very little about any of it, because he was my son, and because some things a mother knows must be kept quietly, the way you keep a lit candle behind glass, present, necessary, protected from the wind. After Duke died, I thought grief would make Min softer. That is a foolish thing to think. I understand that now. Grief does not make people softer. It shows them more clearly what they already were. He came to the house 3 days after the funeral, while I was still washing the dishes from the reception. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said that he wanted to help. That I didn't need to manage everything alone anymore. That he could take care of certain things if I would let him. I was tired. I was 62 years old and my husband had been dead for 72 hours. And the house still smelled like the flowers from his funeral and the incense I had been burning without stopping since the night he passed. I said yes. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and I said yes, and I went back to the dishes, and in the front room the incense on the altar burned down to nothing while I wasn't watching. That autumn, Min introduced me to Derek Stafford. He was a trim man in his mid-40s with a firm handshake and a folder of credentials he spread across my kitchen table without being asked. American. Efficient. Fluent in the language of taxation in a way that was meant to impress. He explained his process carefully. He used phrases like streamlined compliance and maximum return optimization. He smiled often. His teeth were very white. I watched his hands while he talked. Clean nails, a watch that was not cheap, the kind of man who understood exactly how much things cost and had arranged his appearance accordingly. I asked him 3 questions about depreciation schedules. He answered 2 of them correctly and deflected the third with a smile and a phrase about software handling those calculations automatically. I noticed. I said nothing. That evening, after they had gone, I sat at my kitchen table alone and opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote Derek Stafford's name. Below it, I wrote the date. Below that, I wrote 1 line, in my smallest, most careful handwriting. Check everything. Somewhere outside, a motorbike backfired and a dog started barking, and the sound carried through the open window and across the room and dissolved into the quiet dark of a house that had not yet finished deciding what it was going to become. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were the days I went to the market on Tran Phu Street, the one with the woman who sold dried shrimp from a basket covered with a square of blue cloth, and I had come home with my bag still in my hand when I saw it sitting on the mat inside the front door, a white envelope, official. The IRS return address printed in the upper left corner in that particular shade of government blue. I had spent decades recognizing across a desk. I set my bag down. I picked up the envelope. I stood in the hallway with the smell of the market still on my clothes, dried fish and bruised lemongrass and the faint sweetness of overripe mangoes, and I opened it the way I opened all official correspondence, carefully, with a letter knife, preserving the envelope intact. The refund amount was printed clearly on the second page. I read it once. Then I set the letter down on the hallway table and went to the kitchen and put the dried shrimp away and washed my hands and dried them and came back and read it again. $4,200 less than I had calculated. Not a rounding error. Not a processing fee I had failed to account for. A significant, specific, inexplicable difference between the number I expected and the number printed on that page in government blue ink. I sat down at the kitchen table with my notebook, the same small-lined notebook I had kept for every tax year since 1992, the kind with the orange cover that used to cost 12,000 dong at the stationery shop near the old office. I opened it to the page where I had worked out my own figures the previous February, before I handed the authorization forms to Min, before Derek Stafford had taken possession of my documents and filed everything on my behalf. My handwriting looked back at me. Precise, unhurried, each figure in its column. The numbers did not match. I sat with that for a long time. The ceiling fan moved the air in slow circles overhead. Through the open window, I could hear the neighbor's television, some afternoon drama with a lot of raised voices, and the distant sound of a motorbike accelerating down the alley. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a Thursday afternoon that had no reason to feel different from any other Thursday afternoon. But something had shifted, very slightly, the way a door shifts when the wood swells in the wet season, not broken, not obviously wrong, just no longer fitting exactly as it once had. I told myself it was possible I had made an error. I was 66 years old, and I had been retired for 4 years, and perhaps my calculations were no longer as reliable as they once were. I was aware this was the kind of thought a person allows themselves when they are not yet ready to consider the alternative. I checked my figures again anyway. I checked them 3 times, with a fresh sheet of paper and a pencil, working through the W-2 from my small consultancy work, and the 1,099 from the interest on Duke's savings account and the standard deduction figures I had memorized years ago and verified against the current year's guidelines that morning online before I went to the market. My figures were correct. I called Min that evening after dinner. He answered on the 3rd ring, which was typical. Min had a way of letting the phone ring twice before answering that I had always suspected was deliberate, a small performance of being too occupied to respond immediately. His father used to find it amusing. I had never found it amusing, but I had never said so. The refund came, I said. Good. Derek said it should arrive this week. The amount is different from what I calculated. A pause, brief, but present. These things happen, Mama. The tax code is complicated. Derek has software that catches things. I understand the tax code, I said. I used it professionally for 32 years. Another pause. Longer this time. I know you did, but you're retired now. Derek handles this. I looked at the letter on the table in front of me. The government blue of the return address had gone gray in the evening light. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation overhead. I would like to see the filed return, I said. The complete copy. Every page. Mama, why? It's handled. Everything is fine. I would like to see it. His voice changed then, not dramatically, not enough that a person who wasn't listening carefully would have noticed. Just a slight adjustment in register, the way a person shifts their weight when they are standing in one position too long. I'll ask Derek to send you a copy. It might take a few days. That's fine, I said. I'll wait. After we hung up, I sat at the table without moving for several minutes. The incense on the altar had burned down during the afternoon, and I hadn't replaced it. The 2 sticks of ash sat in the ceramic holder, curved slightly at their tips, still holding their shape even though there was nothing left of them that had any substance. A week passed. Then 10 days. The copy of the filed return did not arrive. I called Derek Stafford's office number, the one on the business card he had laid on my kitchen table 18 months ago. A woman answered. She was professional, pleasant, apologetic. Mr. Stafford was traveling. She would leave a message. I said thank you. I hung up. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I wrote the date and the time and the name of the woman I had spoken to and the exact words she had used, because that is what you do when you have spent 32 years working with documents, and you understand that the record is the only thing that cannot be revised by someone else's account of events. Min called 2 days later. I talked to Derek. He says the discrepancy is from a change in how the AMT interacts with your consulting income. He'll write it up and send you an explanation. I would still like to see the filed return. He'll include that. When? Soon, Mama. Why are you making this difficult? We're trying to help you. I looked across the room at my husband's photograph on the altar. Duke laughing, eyes almost closed, caught at the exact moment before joy became composure. The explanation never came. Not that week. Not the following week. And somewhere in the silence where the paperwork should have been, I began to feel something settle into the back of my mind, with the quiet certainty of a figure that has been checked and rechecked and refuses to resolve the cold, specific understanding that the problem was not in my calculations. The problem was in theirs. And they knew that I knew, which meant that whatever came next would not be an oversight. It would be a decision. I have always trusted paper more than people. Paper does not hedge. Paper does not adjust its tone based on what it thinks you want to hear. A number written on a page in black ink either matches the number written on another page or it does not, and no amount of explanation or reassurance or careful redirection changes that fundamental fact. This is what 32 years of tax work taught me, if it taught me nothing else. The document is the truth. Everything else is interpretation. So when the filed return finally arrived not from Derek Stafford's office, not through Min, but through the IRS online portal where I had maintained my own account since 2009, I sat down at my desk in the back bedroom with my reading glasses and my notebook and a cup of tea that went completely cold before I finished, and I read every page with the same attention I had given to every document that had ever passed across my desk in 32 years of professional life. The return looked correct. That was the first thing I noticed. Not correct in the way that a hasty filing looks correct, all the obvious boxes filled, all the required signatures present, but carefully, deliberately, convincingly correct. The kind of correct that takes effort. The kind of correct that someone has thought about. I opened my notebook. I worked through the figures line by line. The W-2 income matched what I had reported to Min. The 1,099 interest income matched. The standard deduction was applied properly. The tax liability calculation was clean, but the refund amount was still $4,200 less than my own calculation produced. I went back. I checked the deductions. Standard deduction? Correct. No itemized claims, which was accurate. I had not itemized since the year Duke died, when the medical expenses had made it worth the additional paperwork. No claimed credits. No. I stopped. I went back to page 3, and I read it again. There was a line I had passed over on the first reading because it appeared unremarkable, the way important things sometimes disguise themselves as routine entries. A dependent care credit, modest amount. Filed against my income. I do not have dependents. I have not had dependents since Thuy finished her university degree in 2014. I set my pencil down carefully on the desk beside my notebook. The ceiling fan in the back bedroom was slower than the one in the kitchen, something Duke had always said he would fix and never did, and it turned overhead in its unhurried way, while I sat very still and looked at that line on page 3. A dependent care credit claimed on my return for a dependent I do not have. The amount was not large. $1,400, which reduced my refund by the corresponding sum after the credit interaction was calculated through. It was the kind of amount that would not alarm an auditor. The kind of amount a person might attribute to a filing error if they noticed it at all, which most people would not, because most people do not read their tax returns line by line with 32 years of professional experience and a notebook full of their own independently calculated figures. I am not most people. I opened my laptop, I logged into the IRS portal, and I pulled up the prior year's return, the first year Derek Stafford had filed on my behalf. I had not thought to check it carefully at the time. I had been grieving. I had been tired in the particular way that comes not from physical exertion but from the sustained effort of continuing to move through ordinary days when a large part of your ordinary life has recently been removed from it. The prior year's return had the same line. Different amount. Smaller. $840. But the same category dependent care credit and the same problem. I had no dependents in that year either. I sat back in my chair. The room was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon was winding down toward evening. I could hear the family 2 houses away sitting down to their meal, the clink of dishes, a child's voice rising above the general sound of it before subsiding. Normal sounds. Sounds that had no relationship to what I was looking at on the screen in front of me. I made myself be methodical. Emotion is not useful when you are examining evidence. I had learned this early, in the first years of my career, when I had discovered a discrepancy in a client's filing that turned out to involve their business partner and their brother-in-law, and a series of transactions that none of the 3 parties had wanted examined closely. I had been 28 years old, and I had felt sick about it for 2 days before I sat down and decided that feeling sick was not the same as being wrong, and that being wrong required actual evidence of wrongness, not just the discomfort of suspicion. I was not 28 now, and this time the evidence was in front of me, on my own return, under my own name. 2 years of fabricated dependent care credits. 2 years of refunds reduced by amounts that disappeared somewhere between the IRS calculation and my bank account. 2 years of Derek Stafford's careful, convincing, deliberately unremarkable filings. I got up from the desk. I went to the kitchen and I put water on for fresh tea. I stood at the window while I waited for it to boil, and I watched the alley below the woman from the house opposite hanging laundry in the last of the afternoon light. A cat moving along the top of the wall with its particular boneless certainty. A motorbike threading through the narrow space with the practiced ease of long familiarity. The water boiled. I made tea. I carried it back to the desk. I opened the blue tin box, and I removed the folder marked with the first year of Derek Stafford's filings, and I took out the copy of the original W-2 that I had kept, the physical form that the consultancy had mailed me in January of that year, before anything had been filed. Before Min had collected the documents from me in a manila envelope and driven away with them in the back seat of his car. I held the W-2 next to the corresponding figure on the filed return. The income figure matched exactly. I held the copy of the 1,099 next to its corresponding line. That matched too. I went through every figure I had an original source document for. Every one of them matched, which meant that whoever had added the false dependent care credits had been careful enough to fabricate only what could not be easily cross-referenced against a document in my possession. They had not touched the income figures. They had not altered anything that I might check directly against a form I had kept. They had added things that weren't there. And then it occurred to me slowly, with the particular cold clarity of a calculation that has been completed correctly and produces a result you were hoping it wouldn't, that if they had done this for 2 years, there was no particular reason they had only done this. I looked at the blue tin box. I counted the folders inside it. Then I opened my laptop again and I logged back into the IRS portal, and when the screen loaded and showed me the list of all returns filed under my taxpayer identification number for the past 6 years, I saw something that made me set my tea down very carefully on the desk so that my hands would have something deliberate to do. There were 2 returns filed for tax year 2020. Mine, and one I had never seen before. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the desk in the back bedroom until the alley outside went completely quiet and the family 2 houses away turned off their lights, and the cat that had been moving along the wall disappeared into whatever darkness cats disappear into, and I worked, the way I had always worked when something needed to be understood methodically, without rushing, moving through each layer of the problem, the way you move through a complicated filing, one line at a time, not allowing yourself to draw conclusions before the evidence supports them. The second return for tax year 2020 was not a duplicate. That was the first thing I confirmed, and confirming it took 40 minutes of careful navigation through the IRS portal, cross-referencing submission dates and confirmation numbers, and the identifying details attached to each filing. A duplicate would have been simple, a technical error, a double submission, something the system would have flagged and resolved automatically. This was not that. The first return had been submitted on the 14th of February 2021. That was the one I recognized, the one Derek Stafford had filed on my behalf, the one Min had told me was handled. Standard submission date, nothing unusual about the timing. The second return had been submitted on the 3rd of March 2021, 17 days later, under my taxpayer identification number, with an amended filing status that superseded the February return and directed the adjusted refund amount to a different bank account. Not my bank account. I wrote the routing number and account number down in my notebook in my smallest handwriting. I looked at those numbers for a long time. They meant nothing to me. On their own, a routing number is just a routing number, 9 digits that identify a financial institution, anonymous and uninformative, without additional context. But the fact of them sat in my chest like a stone. Someone had filed an amended return in my name. Someone had redirected my refund to an account I did not own. I pulled up tax year 2019, filed on time in February, no amendment. Refund to my account, amount lower than my calculation by $840. Tax year 2021, filed February, no amendment. Refund lower by $1,400. Tax year 2022. Filed February, no amendment. Refund lower by $2,100. And tax year 2020. Filed February. Amended March. Refund redirected entirely. I turned back through my notebook to the page where I had recorded the 2020 refund. I had noted the deposit in April of that year, the amount, the date it cleared. I had been pleased with it. It was a reasonable return, close enough to my own calculation that I had attributed the small difference to the dependent care credit anomaly I had not yet fully examined. I looked at that deposit amount. Then I went back to the portal and I looked at what the amended return had actually claimed. The original February return had produced a refund of $6,400. The amended March return had produced a refund of $11,200. The difference, $4,800, had gone to the account I did not own. My account had received $6,400, the original amount, so I had noticed nothing. I had checked the deposit, confirmed it matched the figure Min had mentioned, and moved on. The amended return had run parallel to my knowledge of the transaction, invisible, drawing money from the IRS in my name without my account ever showing a discrepancy I might have noticed. It was well constructed. I sat with that recognition for a moment. The way you sometimes have to acknowledge the craftsmanship in something, even when the thing itself is entirely wrong. I made tea. I stood in the kitchen while the water boiled, and I thought about Derek Stafford's firm handshake and his folder of credentials, and the way he had deflected my question about depreciation schedules with a smile and a reference to software. A man who understood exactly how much things cost and had arranged his appearance accordingly. A man who knew which questions an elderly retired accountant was likely to ask and which answers would satisfy her well enough that she wouldn't look further. He had not anticipated that I kept everything. I brought the tea back to the desk and I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I began to construct a timeline. Every tax year Derek Stafford had filed on my behalf. Every return, every refund amount, every discrepancy I could now identify. I wrote in the margins, small annotations in pencil, the way I had always marked documents that required follow-up. By 2 a.m. I had a number. Total discrepancies across 4 years, combining the fabricated dependent care credits and the one fully redirected amended refund, $31,420. The same number I had calculated weeks ago at this same desk. The number I had underlined once and stared at while the incense burned down to ash. I had reached it from a different direction this time, working forward through the portal records instead of backward from my own figures, and arriving at the same sum from 2 independent paths of calculation felt like something closing, a bracket completing itself. The particular satisfaction of a proof that holds. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then I looked at the routing number on the amended 2020 return, and I picked up my phone, and I called Thuy. She answered on the second ring. It was past 2 a.m. She answered anyway, the way she always did, because Thuy understood that a call from me at 2 a.m. was not a casual thing. "Mama, what's wrong?" Not a question, a statement. She had always been able to hear what was underneath my voice. "I need you to do something for me tomorrow morning," I said. "Something that requires your professional license to access certain pharmacy benefit databases." A pause. "Tell me what you need," I told her. I explained about the routing number, about the amended return, about what I suspected, but could not yet confirm from a tax portal alone. She was quiet while I talked, the particular quiet of someone who is listening with complete attention and not interrupting, because they understand that interruption is not useful. When I finished, she said, "Give me the numbers." I read her the routing number and the account number from my notebook. She repeated them back to me exactly. "I'll call you at 9, she said. "Thank you, Mama." Her voice shifted. Just slightly. "Are you safe?" I looked across the hall to the front room, where the altar sat in the corner, Duke's photograph visible even in the low light from the desk lamp. His laughing face, his almost closed eyes. "I am perfectly safe," I said. "I am sitting in our house with 36 years of records, and a notebook, and a pot of tea." She was quiet again for a moment. 9 o'clock, she said, and we hung up. I went back to my desk. I reread the timeline I had constructed. I checked each figure one more time. Then I turned to the page at the back of the notebook where I kept contact information, and I found the number for Linda Tran, my former colleague, the woman who had sat beside me for 11 years in the accounting office, and who had, unlike me, continued working after 62 and obtained her IRS enrolled agent certification. I did not call her yet. It was past 2 in the morning, and there were things I still needed to confirm before I involved anyone else in what I was looking at. But I wrote her name at the top of the fresh page, and I drew a line under it, and I added a single question that had been forming at the back of my mind since I first saw the routing number, and that had sharpened now into something I needed answered with urgency. The question was this. The account that had received the redirected refund from tax year 2020, I had assumed it belonged to Derek Stafford, or to some intermediary arrangement he had constructed. That was the obvious assumption, and it was probably correct. But when Thuy called me at 9 the next morning, her voice was not the voice of someone delivering a confirmation. It was the voice of someone who had found something she did not want to have found. "Mama," she said, "the account. I traced the routing number." I picked up my pencil. "It belongs to a business," she said. "Registered in Da Nang. Import-export. License 2019. The pencil was very still in my hand. "The registered owner," Thuy said, and then she stopped, and in the silence before she said his name I already knew it. The way you know the answer to a calculation before you finish writing it out, the way the numbers always tell you the truth before you are ready to hear it. I have never been a woman who moves quickly. This is not a limitation, it is a method. In 32 years of tax work, I watched colleagues make decisions fast, confident, decisive, visibly certain, and I watched those same colleagues spend the following weeks untangling the consequences of conclusions drawn before the evidence was complete. Speed impresses people. Accuracy solves problems. I was never interested in impressing people, so I did not call Min. I did not drive to Da Nang to confront him. I did not call Linda Tran that morning and present my findings and ask her what to do. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at my notebook for a long time, at the number underlined at the bottom of the page and the routing number below it, and Thuy's voice still sitting in my memory like a stone dropped into water, still sending ripples outward. Then I made a list. The first item on the list was, confirm what can be confirmed independently. The second item was, find someone who can confirm what I cannot. The third item was, say nothing to anyone who does not need to know. I started with the IRS portal. I had been using it since 2009, but had never navigated to the section that allowed a taxpayer to flag a potential identity theft or unauthorized filing. I found it after 20 minutes of careful searching. The process was straightforward: a form, a series of questions, a request for supporting documentation. I did not submit the form yet. I read through it 3 times, noted the documentation requirements in my notebook, and closed the window. I needed originals. Everything the form required, I had in the blue tin box or the filing cabinet in the back bedroom. Original W-2 forms, original 1099s, my own handwritten calculations, dated and signed the way I had always signed working documents, because a signature and a date make a personal record into something a third party can verify. I spent Tuesday morning pulling every relevant document from the cabinet and organizing them on the desk in the back bedroom. One tax year at a time, each year's materials in its own stack with a paperclip and a handwritten label. The work was quiet and familiar, the kind of work that had always settled something in me, the physical act of ordering documents, of imposing structure on information that had previously existed in scattered form. Duke used to say I was happiest when I had something to sort. He was right, though I never told him so. By noon, I had 6 stacks on the desk, each one representing a year of Derek Stafford's filings, set against my own independently calculated figures and original source documents. The picture they formed was comprehensive, and it was significantly worse than I had initially calculated. I had found the amended return for 2020 through the IRS portal. What I had not yet examined carefully were the original February filings for the other years, set against the source documents I actually held. On Tuesday afternoon, working slowly and checking each figure twice, I found what I had feared I would find. Across all 4 years, the fabricated dependent care credits were not the only additions. There were small deductions claimed that I could not source to any document in my possession, charitable contributions in amounts I had no record of making, a home office deduction for a consulting arrangement I had discontinued in 2019. Each individual item was modest, unremarkable. The kind of entry an auditor passing quickly through a return might note and move on from. Taken together, across 4 years, they added up to something considerably more than I had initially underlined. I did not revise the figure in my notebook yet. I wanted Linda Tran to see the documents before I committed to a final number. I wanted a second set of professional eyes, someone whose certification meant her confirmation would carry weight beyond my own. I called her on Wednesday morning at 8:45. She answered with the same brisk efficiency she had brought to every working day in the 11 years we had shared an office. Linda was 61, still working, still sharp in the particular way that comes from staying engaged with something you are genuinely good at. "Lan Fuang," she said, "it has been too long." "Yes. I need your eyes on something." A brief pause. She understood from my tone that this was not a social call. "How soon?" "As soon as you can manage." She came on Friday afternoon. I did not tell her anything in advance. I wanted her reaction to be to the documents, not to my interpretation of the documents. I set her up at the desk in the back bedroom with the 6 stacks of materials and a fresh notebook, and left her alone for 2 hours while I tended the altar and made a proper meal for the first time in several days. The smell of the incense moved through the house while I cooked, slow and familiar. The scent of every ordinary day this house had held for 35 years. The scent of every morning I had stood at the altar and spoken quietly to my husband's photograph. There is a saying my mother used, one she had from her mother and that I had never found a satisfactory way to translate into any other language. Still water runs deepest. The river that makes no noise is the one that has carved the farthest into the rock. I had been still for a long time, longer than even I had realized. Standing in the kitchen with the incense smoke moving through the afternoon light, I understood that my stillness now was not the stillness of a woman who did not know what was happening. It was the stillness of a river that has already decided where it is going. Linda came to the kitchen doorway at 4:30. I looked at her face. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. I poured tea. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at me with an expression I recognized from the old office, the expression she wore when a client's filing had revealed something the client had not anticipated needing to explain. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 weeks for the full picture." "Longer, in the way you know something before you know it." She nodded. She understood that distinction. "The amended 2020 return is the most serious," she said. "That is a direct refund theft. The rest is fraud, systematic, carefully constructed, but the amended return is where a prosecutor starts." "I know. You need an enrolled agent to formally document this before you file anything with the IRS. The form requires professional certification for it to move as quickly as you'll want it to move." She looked at me steadily. "I can do that." "I was hoping you would say that. I'll need 2 weeks to prepare the documentation properly." "I want to be thorough. I want you to be thorough." She nodded again, then looked down at her tea. A long moment passed. "Lan Fuang, the business registration in Da Nang. The account." "Yes. Have you spoken to him?" "No." "Good, don't." I had not intended to, but I appreciated her saying it. She left at 5:30 with photographs of every document, her phone camera, systematic, every page of every stack, the same way I would have done it. At the door she paused and looked back at me with something in her face that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but somewhere in the complicated space between them. "You kept everything," she said. "I always kept everything." She left. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet of the house, the incense long since burned to ash, the evening settling in through the windows in its gradual way. Then I went back to the desk in the back bedroom, and I opened my laptop and I began, slowly and carefully, to draft the letter I would need to send to the IRS. But when I opened the portal to reference the case documentation, I found something I had not placed there. A note in the messaging section of my IRS account, submitted 3 days ago, from a taxpayer representative I had never authorized. The name on the authorization was Derek Stafford. And the note said that the account holder had requested a change of correspondence address to Minja's address in Da Nang. I sat very still for a long time. Then I picked up my pencil, and I added a fourth item to my list. Min arrived on a Sunday without calling first. That was how I knew it had begun in earnest. He had always called before coming, not out of courtesy. I understood now. But because advance notice allowed him to prepare, to arrange his face and his words into the configuration most likely to produce the result he wanted. Arriving unannounced meant he had moved past the stage where preparation was necessary. He had decided the outcome already. I was at the desk in the back bedroom when I heard the front gate. Through the window, I watched him walk up the path in a pale gray shirt. His business partner from Da Nang, a man I had met twice, whose name I consistently failed to retain, following 2 steps behind carrying a leather document folder. Not Derek Stafford, someone else. Someone I did not know, which meant someone I could not yet read. I closed my notebook. I put it in the drawer. I went to the kitchen and put water on for tea because having something to do with my hands is useful, and because a person who is making tea appears to be doing nothing except making tea. Min knocked once and opened the front door without waiting. He had a key. He had always had a key, given freely, years ago. Because he was my son, and the house was his childhood home, and I had not yet learned to think carefully about what access meant. Mama. He came into the kitchen and kissed my cheek in the way he had learned to do from his wife, European, brief, a gesture that looked like affection and felt like a transaction. You should have told me you were having trouble understanding your tax documents. I would have come sooner. I looked at him. I am not having trouble understanding anything, I said. Of course not. His voice had that particular quality I had been hearing for several months now, patient, gently corrective. The tone one uses with someone who is confused but does not yet know they are confused. Derek mentioned you had some questions. That's completely natural. These documents can be complicated. The man with the folder set it on my kitchen table without asking. He opened it. Inside were papers, printed copies, official letterhead, multiple pages. He stood back with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to be present without appearing to have opinions. I wanted to sort things out properly, Min said. Derek and I talked, and we think the cleanest solution is to simplify your financial arrangements going forward. Fewer accounts, clearer oversight. He picked up the top document from the folder. This is a full power of attorney. It allows me to manage your accounts directly, the tax filings, the bank correspondence, all of it. It's much simpler. I did not reach for the document. I don't need my accounts managed, I said. Mama. He set the paper down on the table in front of me. His voice dropped into something softer, more private. The voice he used when he wanted to sound like a concerned son rather than a man with a leather folder. Mr. Huang saw you standing in the garden last week. He said you were there for almost an hour. Just standing. I had been examining the drainage along the east wall, which had been silting up since the last rainy season. I had been standing there for perhaps 15 minutes. Mr. Hong worries too much, I said. He called me. He said he was concerned. Min paused, letting that settle. And Linda Tran came to the house on Friday. You didn't mention that to me. I said nothing. Who else have you been talking to, Mama? I looked at the power of attorney document on my kitchen table. Full authority over financial accounts, bank correspondence, tax matters, investment decisions. The signature line at the bottom waited with its particular blankness. This is a significant document, I said. It's a practical one. I just want to help you manage things properly. You want to manage my accounts. I want to make sure everything is handled correctly. Derek is going to continue filing, of course. I'll oversee. It's much simpler this way. The man with the folder had moved to stand near the kitchen doorway, blocking it with the casual certainty of someone who did not expect to need to block it, but had positioned himself there regardless. The water had boiled. I did not pour it. I would like to read this carefully before I sign anything, I said. Min's expression did not change, but something behind it did a very slight recalibration, a shift in weight. He was not alarmed. He was adjusting, the way a person adjusts when they encounter minor friction they had not expected but are entirely prepared to handle. Of course, he said, but I'd like to get it sorted today, while I'm here. It's a straightforward document. Everything is straightforward to the person who wrote it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled, and it was the worst kind of smile, genuine, unguarded, the smile of a man who has decided that what he is seeing is not a threat. "I'll make tea," he said, and moved past me to the kitchen. He moved through my kitchen with the ease of ownership. Opened the cabinet where I kept the cups correct on the first try, which told me he had been paying attention for longer than I had, filled the kettle from the tap, found the tea without searching, set the cups on the counter in the arrangement I always used, which meant he had watched me enough to remember it. I stood at the table and looked at the power of attorney document. Underneath it, partially visible, was another page, different letterhead. I could read only the first line before Min moved back to the table and shifted the stack, but that single line was enough. Petition for declaration of diminished capacity prepared on behalf of Nguyen Min, regarding Nguyen Thi Lan Phuong. I looked up. He was watching me from across the kitchen. Tea in his hand, expression arranged into careful concern. The man with the folders stood at the doorway. The house was very quiet around us. "Mama," Min said gently, "you've been working yourself up over numbers and documents for weeks. You've barely been sleeping. Mr. Hoang is worried. Your neighbors are worried. Linda Tran is your friend from 30 years ago. It's not healthy to be dragging her into your anxieties." He crossed to the table, set the tea in front of me with a soft click of ceramic against wood. "I love you. I'm trying to help you. That's all this is." He believed it. That was the thing I could not look away from. He was sitting across from me in the kitchen his father had chosen because of the light, and he believed the version of events he had constructed, or had been persuaded to believe, or had allowed himself to believe because belief made the rest of it easier to carry. I looked at my husband's photograph visible through the kitchen doorway, on the altar in the front room. I looked at the power of attorney document. I looked at the partial heading of the diminished capacity petition, its edge showing beneath the stack. Then I picked up my tea and I held it with both hands and I said nothing at all, because I had learned, a long time ago, that silence is not the same as agreement, and that the most dangerous thing I could do in this moment was let him know how clearly I could see exactly what he was doing. He talked for another 20 minutes, explained the documents, used words like streamlined and protective and peace of mind. His business associate stood at the doorway and looked at the wall. When Min finally left, he took the unsigned power of attorney with him. He left the diminished capacity petition on the table, whether by accident or intention I did not yet know. I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time after the gate closed behind him. Then I picked up my phone and I called Linda Tran and I said, "We need to move faster." "How much faster?" she asked. I looked at the petition on my kitchen table, at my husband's face in the other room, at the notebook locked in the drawer of the back bedroom desk. "As fast as you can go," I said. And I realized, sitting in the kitchen my husband had loved, that my son had come to my house today believing he was already holding all the cards. He had not thought to ask whether I had been keeping my own hand for 32 years. Linda called me on a Tuesday morning at 7:45. I was at the altar. I had just replaced the incense 2 fresh sticks, the way I always did, the way I had done every morning for 7 years without missing a single day. The smoke had barely begun to rise when my phone rang, and something in the timing felt like an interruption of something sacred, which I noted and set aside, because I could not afford to be superstitious at this particular moment in my life. "I need you to come to my office," Linda said. "Bring the blue box." Her voice was the voice she used when she had found something she had not expected to find. I had heard it twice before in 11 years of working beside her, once, when a client's charitable foundation turned out to be entirely fictitious, and once when a routine estate filing revealed that the deceased had been running 2 separate tax identities for 20 years. Both times, that voice had meant, "What I have found is worse than what we were looking for." I was at her office by 9. She had spread the documents across her conference table in a sequence I recognized: chronological, source documents on the left, corresponding filed returns on the right, discrepancies marked in red pencil in the margin. The organized language of 2 women who had spent their careers making disorder legible. I sat down. She sat across from me. Between us, 7 years of my financial life, laid out in 2 parallel lines. "I went back further than you asked me to," she said. "I wanted to be certain I had the complete picture." "How far back?" "To the year Derek Stafford took over your filings." I looked at the table. 4 years of documents on the right side, organized into stacks, and then I saw that the left side had more stacks than I had given her. 2 additional years. Documents I had not pulled from the filing cabinet, had not brought to her, had not included in the blue box. "Those are not mine," I said. "No," she said. "They are not." She slid a manila folder across the table toward me. Inside were printed pages, IRS records, official formatting, my taxpayer identification number at the top of each page. Returns for years I had filed myself, before Derek Stafford, before Min had suggested that I needed help managing things. Returns I had prepared and submitted independently, correctly, with the same care I had brought to 32 years of professional work. "Someone filed amendments to those years," Linda said. Her voice was very steady. 2 years before Derek Stafford officially took over. Amended returns, submitted without your knowledge, making small adjustments, modest refund claims, modest amounts. She paused. Each one under $2,000. I looked at the pages. Thuy was finishing her residency that year, I said. I did not know why I said it. It was not relevant to the documents in front of me. The amendments were filed using a preparer identification number registered to a different name, not Derek Stafford. A shell credential. It took me 2 days to trace it back. She slid another page across the table. I looked at the preparer identification number, looked at the business registration attached to it, looked at the name on the registration. I have faced difficult numbers before. I have sat across from clients and delivered findings that ended marriages, that exposed business partners of 30 years, that reduced grown men to silence. I understood, professionally and personally, that documents do not soften their findings based on the feelings of the person. There is a particular kind of preparation that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. I have always known how to do this. In 32 years of tax work, the most important days were never the days when things happened visibly, the meetings, the filings, the formal submissions with their signatures and deadlines. The important days were the ones before all of that. The quiet days when you sat alone with your documents and your notebook, and you made absolutely certain that every element was in its proper place, that nothing had been left to assumption, that when the moment came you would not be reaching for something you had forgotten to prepare. I spent the week after Linda's office in that kind of preparation. I told no one what I was doing. Not Thuy, who called on Sunday as always and heard nothing unusual in my voice. Not Mr. Huang, who came over on Wednesday afternoon with a bag of rambutans from his cousin's garden and sat with me on the porch for an hour talking about the weather and the neighbor's new fence. Not anyone. The work I was doing did not need an audience. It needed accuracy and patience and the kind of focused silence that I had been practicing. Without knowing I was practicing it, for most of my adult life, the first thing I did was make a master index. Every document Linda had certified, every original I held in the blue tin box in the filing cabinet, every page of my handwritten calculations I cataloged them in a new notebook, the same kind I had always used, orange cover, lined pages, purchased from the stationery shop on Tran Phu Street. Each entry noted the document type, the tax year it pertained to, the location in my files, and a one-line description of what it proved. By the time I finished, the index ran to 23 pages. 23 pages of evidence that had existed, in one form or another, since the year my husband died. I had kept everything. I had simply not known for most of those years that I was building a case. The second thing I did was organize the documents into 3 separate packets, each one a complete set. The first packet was for the IRS. Linda had advised me on exactly what the identity theft and fraudulent filing complaint required, and I assembled those materials with the same care I had once brought to the most complex corporate filings in my professional life. Original W-2s. Original 1099s. The amended return for 2020, with the routing number traced to Minja's Da Nang business, Linda's certified analysis, signed and dated. My own calculations, every year, in my own handwriting. The second packet was for a lawyer. I had spent 2 evenings researching tax fraud attorneys in the city, the way I had once researched anything important, methodically, reading credentials and case records and professional memberships, looking for someone whose background suggested they understood both the tax law dimension and the family dimension of what I was bringing them. I found a woman named Miss Pham Bichnock, whose firm had handled 3 IRS fraud cases in the past 5 years, 2 of which had involved forged authorization documents. I had not yet called her. I would call her when the packet was complete. The third packet I made 2 copies of and sealed in separate envelopes. 1 copy went inside the blue tin box. The other I mailed to Thuy with a letter that said only, "Keep this somewhere safe and do not open it unless I ask you to." She called me the same evening the envelope arrived. "Mama." "Yes." "What is this?" "It is insurance," I said. "Nothing is going to happen. But if something does, you will have what you need." A long pause. I could hear her breathing. Steady and deliberate. The breathing of a woman who was deciding how frightened to allow herself to be. "Are you in danger?" "No. But your brother has filed a petition to have me declared legally incompetent." I said it the same way I would say the weather forecast plainly, without drama, because drama was not useful. He wants guardianship over my finances and my medical decisions. If that petition succeeds, the evidence I have assembled becomes much harder to act on. Another pause. "The hearing date," she said. 3 weeks. "I'm coming." "Not yet. When I ask you to come immediately. Until then, continue as normal." "Mama, I don't understand how you are this calm." I looked at the altar across the room, the incense burning, the smoke rising in its unhurried way, Duke's face in the photograph, his laughing eyes. "I am not calm," I said. "I am prepared. Those are different things." After we hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of the house. The evening was warm. Through the open window came the sounds of the alley settling into night, a television somewhere, a child being called in from the street, the particular soft percussion of a neighborhood that has been inhabited for a long time by people who know one another's routines. I thought about Min. I had been thinking about him carefully and deliberately all week, the way I thought about complex problems, not emotionally, not yet, but analytically, working to understand the complete structure of what he had done, so that I could anticipate what he would do next. He had arrived on Sunday believing he had already won. The power of attorney documents, the diminished capacity petition, the correspondence address changed to his name on my IRS account. He had constructed the visible architecture of a woman losing her grip on her own life, and he had done it so methodically, over such a long period of time, that I suspected he had come to believe the architecture himself. That was his weakness. I had been turning it over in my mind all week, looking at it from different angles, the way you look at a figure in a column that doesn't quite resolve, waiting for the angle that reveals the error. A man who believes he has already won stops being careful. He had stopped being careful the Sunday he sat in my kitchen and moved through it with the ease of ownership. The Sunday he left the diminished capacity petition on my table, whether by design or by the carelessness of a person who no longer believed the document would surprise me. He was not being careful anymore. He was administering. He believed the outcome was decided and he was simply managing the remaining steps. This was the space I had been working in all week, in the quiet preparation that looked like nothing from the outside, not trying to outrun him, not trying to be louder or faster or more aggressive than a man who had spent 7 years constructing a very deliberate plan, just filling in the gaps he had left because he had stopped expecting me to look. On Friday morning, I called Miss Pham Bich Nook's office. Her assistant answered. I gave my name. I said that I had a tax fraud matter involving forged IRS documents and an unauthorized amended return, and that I also had a pending competency hearing I needed to address urgently. The assistant put me on hold for less than a minute. Miss Pham came on the line herself. Her voice was direct, unhurried, the voice of someone who did not need to perform competence because they simply possessed it. Tell me the timeline, she said. I told her. All of it. From the first discrepancy to Linda's certified analysis to the changed correspondence addressed to the Sunday Min had arrived with his folder and his business associate, and his gentle, patient, relentlessly condescending concern. I spoke for 12 minutes without consulting my notes, because I had lived inside these facts for long enough that they were organized in my memory the same way they were organized in my files, chronological, sourced, every relevant detail in its proper place. When I finished, Miss Pham was quiet for a moment. You have original source documents for every discrepancy? Yes. And a certified enrolled agent analysis? Complete and signed. And the amended return with the account trace? Yes. Another brief silence. the particular silence of someone recalibrating. "Mrs. Nguyen," she said, "the competency hearing is in 3 weeks." "Yes. We need to meet Monday. I will be there at whatever time you specify." 8 o'clock. "I will be there at 8. After I hung up, I returned to the desk in the back bedroom and I looked at the 3 packets lined up beside the blue tin box and the orange notebook that now held the index of everything I had built. I looked at it for a long time. In 3 weeks, my son was going to walk into a courtroom believing that the woman he had been carefully, systematically diminishing for 7 years had finally been diminished enough to be managed. He had been wrong about that from the beginning. He had simply not yet had the occasion to find out. That occasion was coming, and I had been ready for it for 32 years. The competency hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Miss Pham had told me to arrive at 8:30. I arrived at 8. I sat in the corridor outside the hearing room on a wooden bench with the blue tin box on my lap and my notebook in my bag, and my hands folded the way my mother had taught me to fold them when I was 7 years old and she was teaching me that stillness was not weakness. The corridor smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular institutional stillness of a building where difficult things happen at regular intervals, and the walls have absorbed all of it. At 8:45, Min arrived with his business associate, and a man I had not seen before, younger, carrying a briefcase, the look of someone recently graduated from somewhere that had made him confident before experience had earned him the right to be their lawyer, presumably. They walked past me without stopping. Min glanced at me once. His expression was careful, neutral, the expression of a man managing a situation that he expected to resolve in his favor before lunch. He did not look at the blue tin box. That was interesting. Thuy arrived at 8:50, having taken the overnight bus from Da Nang. She sat beside me on the bench and did not say anything, just put her hand over mine for a moment. Her hand was steady. She had always been the steadiest person I knew. Linda Tran arrived at 8:55, carrying her own folder, her enrolled agent certification visible in a clear sleeve on top. Mr. Hoang Van Duke arrived at 8:58, wearing his best shirt, the blue one he saved for funerals and government offices. He had called me the week before to tell me that whatever I needed him to say about what he had actually observed, he would say it. I had thanked him. He had said there was nothing to thank him for, that he had known my husband for 30 years and that was sufficient reason. At 9 o'clock we went in. The room was smaller than I had expected. A table, chairs, a presiding officer, not a judge, a hearing examiner, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a thick folder, and the expression of someone who had seen many variations of this particular situation and was prepared to be efficient about it. Min and his lawyer sat on one side of the table. Miss Pham and I sat on the other. Thuy and Linda and Mr. Hong sat in the chairs along the wall. Min's lawyer opened. He was smooth and organized. I gave him that. He had witness statements. Mr. Hoang's name appeared, misrepresented. His words from a conversation with Min reconstructed into something Mr. Hoang had not said and would not say. He had a statement from Derek Stafford describing my confusion about my own tax documents, my failure to understand basic filings, my repeated calls asking the same questions. He had a note from a doctor I had seen once, 2 years ago, for a routine check, whose observation that I had seemed fatigued had been extracted from its context and placed in a paragraph that suggested cognitive decline. It was well constructed. I sat and listened to it the way I had once sat and listened to auditors present findings I intended to refute quietly, taking notes in the margin of my notebook, flagging the specific errors of fact that I would address in the correct sequence at the correct time. When Minja's lawyer finished, he sat back with the small, contained satisfaction of a man who had done what he came to do. The hearing examiner looked at Miss Pham. "Counselor." Miss Pham stood. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not raise her voice or use language designed to perform outrage. She simply began, in a clear and methodical voice, to describe what the evidence showed. She described the IRS transcript discrepancies. She described the fabricated dependent care credits. She described the amended return for tax year 2020 and the account to which the redirected refund had been sent. Min's import-export business, registered in Da Nang, traceable through routing numbers that Linda Tran had independently verified and certified. She described the preparer identification number registered in Min's name 6 years ago, 4 months after my husband died. She described 7 years. At the word 7, something changed in the room. The hearing examiner's pen, which had been moving steadily, stopped. She looked up over her reading glasses. Across the table, Min's lawyer leaned toward his client and said something quietly. Min did not respond. He was looking at the table. Miss Pham said, "I would like to enter the supporting documentation into the record." She nodded at me. I set the blue tin box on the table. I had been carrying that box for 6 years without knowing what I was carrying. A retired woman's habit of organization, a refusal to throw anything away. 32 years of professional training that had become so thoroughly a part of how I moved through the world that I had continued doing it automatically, without purpose, simply because it was what I knew how to do. I opened the combination lock, the 4 digits I had set the first week I owned it and never changed, because I saw no reason to change what worked, and I lifted the lid, and I began to place documents on the table in the sequence. Miss Pham and I had organized them on Monday morning in her office. Original W-2 forms. Original 1099s. My handwritten calculations in the orange-covered notebooks, dated and signed. Every year from 1992. Linda's certified analysis, 23 pages, every discrepancy sourced and documented. The IRS transcript showing the second return for tax year 2020, the routing number trace, the preparer ID registration. I placed each document down carefully, without hurry, the way I had placed documents on my desk for 32 years, one at a time, each one in its proper place. The room was very quiet. Min's lawyer was no longer leaning back. I reached the last document in the sequence and I set it down and I folded my hands and I looked across the table at my son. He was looking at the documents. His face had the particular quality of someone watching something they had believed to be safely buried being brought into the light, item by item, in a room full of witnesses. "You spent 30 years adding up other people's numbers," he had said to me, in this same month, in the kitchen of the house his father had chosen because of the light. "You can't even add up your own life anymore." I had said nothing then. I said nothing now. I did not need to. The 37 years of numbers on that table said everything that needed to be said, in the only language that had never required my interpretation, the language of documents, of original sources, of figures that had been written down and kept and organized and preserved through grief and retirement, and 7 years of deliberate, patient, systematic theft. The hearing examiner removed her reading glasses. She looked at the documents. She looked at Linda's certification. She looked at the IRS transcript. Then, she looked at Min's lawyer with an expression that required no translation. "Counselor," she said, "I'm going to need a few minutes with this material." Min's lawyer said something about procedural process and the validity of witness testimony. The hearing examiner listened to approximately 40 seconds of it before she raised one hand. "The petition for declaration of diminished capacity," she said, "is denied." The words landed in the room with the quiet finality of a ledger line that balances. Across the table, Min's lawyer was already gathering his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man recalculating his position. His client had not moved. Min sat with his hands flat on the table, and his eyes on the documents I had placed in front of him, and in his face I could see the exact moment when the architecture he had spent 7 years building resolved, at last, into its actual shape, not a structure he had built, but a record he had created. Every fraudulent filing, every fabricated credit, every amended return, every number, in order, from the beginning. Miss Pham leaned toward me and said, very quietly, "The IRS referral goes in this afternoon. The criminal matter will move separately." I nodded. I looked at the blue tin box, empty now, all its contents laid out on the table in the light. 32 years of keeping everything. I had always known that accuracy was its own kind of patience. I had simply not known, until now, exactly what it had been waiting for. Derek Stafford broke first. I was not surprised. I had watched him at the hearing, sitting in the corridor afterward, while Miss Pham spoke with the examiner about the IRS referral process, and I had read his face the way I had read faces across conference tables for 32 years. He was a man who had arranged his life around the performance of competence, around the suggestion of expertise, around the careful maintenance of a professional presentation that kept people from looking too closely at what was underneath. When that performance was no longer viable, there was nothing structural left to hold him upright. He called Miss Phamb's office 2 days after the hearing. She told me about it that Friday afternoon, sitting across from me at her desk, with the same unhurried directness she had brought to every conversation we had had since Monday morning 3 weeks ago. He wants to cooperate, she said. With whom? Everyone. IRS, criminal investigation. The tax fraud unit. Anyone who will agree to consider his cooperation in the sentencing calculation. She paused. He has documentation. I set down my tea. What kind of documentation? Records of every transaction, bank transfers, account numbers, dates, amounts, his own records, which he kept. She looked at me steadily. He kept them as insurance, in case Min ever tried to put the full liability on him alone. I thought about that for a moment. Two men who had built something dishonest together, each one quietly accumulating evidence against the other, each one preparing for the moment when the partnership became more dangerous than the crime. The particular mathematics of shared guilt. Min knew he had them, I said. It was not a question. Apparently not. Or he believed Derek would never use them. Miss Pham opened her folder. Derek's records go back further than what we found through the portal. He has documentation of the original credential registration, the first amended filings, the account structure Min set up before Derek was brought in. He has correspondence. She slid a page across the desk, including this. It was a printed email, sent 6 years ago, 4 months after Duke's funeral, from Min's personal address to an account registered to the Shell credential. The subject line was blank. The body was 7 sentences. I read it once. Then I read it again, slowly, the way I read every document that required my full attention. The email was operational in tone, matter of fact. It outlined the approach Min intended to take: modest amendments, amounts below the threshold that typically triggered manual review, spread across multiple years to avoid pattern recognition. He had done the research. He understood the system well enough to know where the gaps were. The last sentence said, "She won't notice. She's not working anymore and she's not herself since the funeral." Now is the right time. I folded my hands on the desk. She's not herself since the funeral. He had not been wrong about that. The months after Duke died, I had moved through the house in a kind of careful numbness, doing the necessary things: the altar, the meals, the phone calls, the paperwork, while some essential part of my attention was directed inward, toward the work of understanding what the rest of my life was going to require of me. I had been diminished in that period. Grief does diminish you. It is honest about what it costs, but diminished is not erased. And now, as the right time had become, 6 years later, the wrong calculation at the wrong table in a room full of documentation he had not anticipated I would ever assemble. I looked at the email one more time. I thought about standing in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon with a son who moved through it with the ease of ownership, who called my clarity confusion and my memory a liability, who had sat across from me with patient, constructed concern and said, "You've lost your mind, old woman. You can't even add up your own life anymore." I had said nothing then. I had sat with my tea, and I had looked at my husband's photograph across the room, and I had said nothing, because nothing was the correct answer at that particular moment. This was the correct moment. He said I wouldn't notice, I said. Yes, because I was old. Because I was grieving. Because I had stopped working, and he believed that meant I had stopped thinking. Miss Pham said nothing. She understood that I was not asking for confirmation. 32 years, I said. I spent 32 years developing a habit of mind that does not stop operating because I retired from the office where I practiced it. I kept records because keeping records is what I do. I checked figures because checking figures is what I do. I noticed the discrepancy because noticing discrepancies is what I do. I looked at the email on the desk in front of me. He built his plan on the assumption that I had become someone other than who I am. That was his error. Not the credential registration, not the account structure, not any of the technical components. The error was believing that grief had changed the fundamental nature of what I pay attention to. Miss Pham looked at me for a moment. IRS criminal investigation will want a formal statement, she said. Derek's cooperation accelerates the timeline significantly. The account documentation he's provided traces every transfer directly. The case against Min is, at this point, comprehensively evidenced from 2 independent sources, your records and Derek's. When does it move forward? It's already moving. The referral from the hearing went in Thursday afternoon as I told you it would. Derek's cooperation filing went in this morning. A case with this level of documentation does not wait in a queue. I nodded. I picked up my bag. Mrs. Nguyen. Miss Pham's voice was careful, professional, and underneath it something that was not quite personal, but was adjacent to it. Your son will have an opportunity to respond to the evidence. There will be a process. It will not be immediate. I understand process, I said. I have worked within process my entire life. I know. I want to make certain you are prepared for the fact that he will likely deny, then negotiate, then he will do what people do when the numbers no longer work in their favor, I said. He will look for a different calculation. I have seen it many times. I stood. Let him look. The documents do not change based on the interpretation the person reading them would prefer. She walked me to the door. In the corridor, I passed a woman coming in with a folder and a young man beside her who was speaking rapidly in a low voice. The voice of someone explaining a situation they were hoping sounded better out loud than it did in the documents. I had seen that before, too. The gap between what people believe they can argue and what the paper actually says. The gap always closes. It closes at the same rate for everyone, regardless of how quickly they speak or how well they have arranged their presentation. I walked out into the afternoon. The city was doing what it always did, the motorbikes, the voices, the light moving through the haze in its particular urban way, familiar and indifferent and entirely unchanged by anything that had happened in a small hearing room 2 days ago or a lawyer's office this afternoon. My phone buzzed in my bag. Tui. I answered. Linda called me, she said. She said Derek Stafford filed cooperation documents. Yes, Mama. Her voice was the voice she used when she was trying to determine how to say something she was not certain how to say. Are you all right? I stopped on the pavement, and I looked up at the sky, which was the particular color of late afternoon in this city, pale gold washing toward gray at the edges. The sun somewhere behind the haze, present without being visible. I am exactly who I have always been, I said. That is the whole answer. She was quiet for a moment. Come for dinner Sunday, she said. I'll cook. I'll bring the dried shrimp from Tran Phu Street. After we hung up, I stood on the pavement for another moment, with my bag over my shoulder, and the blue tin box under my arm empty now, its documents entered into evidence, its lock still set to the same 4 digits I had chosen the first week I owned it. I had carried that box for 6 years through a normal life that had not been entirely normal. Tomorrow the IRS would continue its process. Next week, there would be a preliminary criminal filing. In the weeks after that, there would be the particular machinery of consequence moving at its own deliberate pace, indifferent to anyone's preferred timeline, responsive only to the quality and completeness of the evidence presented to it. I had 37 years of evidence. I had always kept everything. That had never been a coincidence. It had been, without my fully knowing it, a preparation. And the preparation had been sufficient. The IRS sent the final resolution letter on a Tuesday morning in late spring. I was in the garden when the notification arrived on my phone, the small patch of ground along the east wall, where I had been meaning to improve the drainage since the previous rainy season, and which I had finally gotten around to doing now that the weeks of hearings and filings and formal statements had settled into the quieter rhythm of process completing itself. I had dirt on my hands and a trowel in my right fist, and the morning light was coming over the roofline in that particular way it did in late spring, warm and unhurried. The kind of light that makes an ordinary garden look like something worth attending to. I set the trowel down. I read the notification. Then I washed my hands at the outdoor tap, dried them on the cloth I kept folded over the garden wall, and went inside to make tea. The letter confirmed what Miss Pham had prepared me to expect. Full restitution of the fraudulently redirected funds, the amended returns reversed, the fabricated credits removed, the corrected refund calculations applied across all 7 years. The number at the bottom of the final restitution calculation was $47,380, the same number I had written in my notebook the morning. Linda Tran sat across from me and read figures aloud in her steady professional voice while I looked at my hands. I had been correct. I had been correct. From the first evening I sat at my kitchen table under the lamp my husband always said was too bright, and compared my own calculations against the filed return and found them $4,200 apart. I was not surprised to be correct. That is not something that requires surprise after 32 years. The criminal proceedings were moving on their own timeline, as criminal proceedings do. Miss Pham had explained the process to me with her customary directness, and I had listened and understood and accepted that the machinery of formal consequence operates at a pace determined by its own requirements rather than anyone's preferred schedule. Min's lawyer was negotiating. Derek Stafford's cooperation had narrowed the available arguments considerably. The outcome was not yet formally determined, but its general shape was visible. I had given my statement. I had provided my documentation. The rest was not mine to control. I had learned, over the course of many decades, which parts of a situation are yours to act on and which parts must simply be allowed to proceed. This is a difficult lesson for most people. It had not been difficult for me, because I had always understood that the document is the thing you prepare and submit, and after that the document does its own work. Your job is to make it accurate. What it accomplishes afterward is between the document and whoever receives it. I poured the tea and I carried it to the front room. The altar was there as it always was. The incense had been lit that morning, as it was every morning, and the smoke had moved through the house and settled into the curtains and the cushions in its familiar way, the scent of every ordinary day this house had held for 35 years. Duke's photograph looked back at me from its place on the dark wood, his laughing face, his almost closed eyes, caught at the moment just before composure. I sat in the chair closest to the altar, which was not something I usually did. I usually stood when I tended the altar, or moved past it. Sitting beside it felt different, more present, like a conversation rather than a maintenance task. I told him about the letter. I described the number at the bottom of the restitution calculation, and explained that it matched my own figures exactly, which I thought he would have found satisfying. He had always respected accuracy, even in domains he did not fully understand. He had never pretended to follow the details of my work, but he had never failed to recognize when the work was done correctly. I told him about Thuy, who had driven up from Da Nang the previous weekend, and helped me repair the garden wall that had been slowly failing on the north side since the last heavy rains. She had worked beside me without needing direction, the way she had always done things, observing first, understanding the task, applying herself to it without performance or complaint. She was going to be all right. She had always been going to be all right. I had simply not stopped long enough, in the past several months, to let myself feel the relief of knowing it. I did not tell him what I was going to do with the restitution. That was not because I was uncertain. I had known what I was going to do with it since the morning the final number became clear, since I had sat at Linda Tran's conference table and looked at the total across 7 years and understood that the money had never been the point. The money was the record of the crime. Recovering it was the formal acknowledgement that the crime had occurred and that the person who committed it had been identified and held accountable. That acknowledgement mattered enormously, but the money itself, what I chose to do with it, was a separate question, and I had answered it quietly and without discussion, because it was my decision and it required no one's input. A portion would go to Linda Tran's professional fees, which she had kept deliberately modest and which I intended to pay at a rate that properly reflected the work she had done. The rest I was dividing into 2 parts. The first part I was placing into an account in Thuy's name, not as inheritance, not as a gift, but as a formal acknowledgement that she had been right to answer every call. Right to come immediately when I asked, right to receive the sealed envelope and keep it without opening it, right to sit on a corridor bench in her best clothes on a Thursday morning, and be present without being asked to perform presence. She had done what a daughter does when a daughter understands what is actually needed. The money was the formal record of that. The second part I was donating to a small legal aid organization in the city that provided assistance to elderly residents navigating financial disputes. Miss Pham had mentioned them in passing during one of our meetings. I had written the name in my notebook and looked them up that evening and read their case descriptions and understood immediately that what I had navigated with professional help and 32 years of expertise and a tin box full of organized records was something that other people faced. Without any of those resources, some of them would lose. Some of them had already lost. I could not undo that. but I could place something useful in the direction of the problem, and that was what I intended to do. I finished my tea. I set the cup on the table beside the chair. Outside the window, the morning was continuing in its ordinary way. The woman across the alley had hung washing on the line. The cat that lived along the top of the wall was performing its daily inspection of the perimeter, unhurried and thorough. A motorbike passed. Then another. The sounds of a neighborhood that had been inhabited for a long time by people living the specific texture of their specific days, most of which would never be documented or examined or entered into any record. I looked at Duke's photograph. I thought about what Thuy had said to me, months ago, when this was still in its early stages and I had sat at my kitchen table in the dark working through figures that refused to resolve. She had said, "You are the most careful person I know, Mama. Whatever you are looking for, you will find it." She had been right. Not because I was exceptional, because I had spent 32 years building habits of mine that do not dissolve in the face of inconvenience or grief, or a son who believed that retirement meant the end of paying attention. My mother used to say it, and her mother before her, still water runs deepest. The river that makes no noise is the one that has carved the farthest into the rock. I had been a still river. I had always been a still river. And the things I had carved, quietly and without announcement, across 32 years of ordinary professional diligence, the records, the notebooks, the orange-covered summaries dating back to 1992, the blue tin box with its lock set to 4 digits. I had never needed to change those things. Had outlasted 7 years of someone else's plan, had outlasted grief and retirement, and the particular vulnerability of a woman alone in a house that had once held more people than it currently did. They had not outlasted me. I picked up my trowel from where I had left it on the garden wall. The earth along the east side still needed attention. The drainage would not repair itself. I went back to work. And in my chest, as steady and unhurried as water moving through stone, I felt what I had always been, the river no one heard coming, that had already arrived. If anyone has ever looked at you and assumed that age meant you had stopped noticing, stopped thinking, stopped being someone worth taking seriously, this story is for you. The quiet ones always keep the most careful records. And the people who underestimate a lifetime of experience almost always regret it. If Lan Fuang's story stayed with you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Golden Years Justice. New stories post every day, and every one of them is about people who refuse to disappear quietly. We want to hear from you. Do you believe someone can truly love a parent and still betray them? Or does what Min did mean the love was never real to begin with?